The light was a liar. It glinted off 1,000 crystal glasses like captured stars, cascaded down the silk lapels of senators, and pooled on the polished marble floor. But it offered no warmth. It was a cold, predatory light, the kind that illuminates flaws and exposes secrets. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel, host to the annual Justice and Jurisprudence Foundation Gala, was a universe unto itself. And Dr. Elijah Washington felt like a foreign body adrift in its glittering cosmos. The air was thick, heavy with the cloying scent of hothouse lilies and the low, self-congratulatory murmur of the nation's legal elite. They orbited each other like celestial bodies, held in place by the invisible gravity of influence, their laughter as carefully modulated as their stock portfolios. Elijah stood near a towering ice sculpture of Lady Justice, her scales perfectly, impossibly balanced, and felt the familiar chill of isolation settle over him. It was a cold he had known for 3 years, a permanent resident in the space once occupied by his best friend. He adjusted the gold cufflinks on his bespoke charcoal suit, a nervous tic he'd never quite managed to shed. His reflection, distorted in the polished silver of a champagne bucket, looked back at him, a man of 42, his face a mask of serene control, his eyes holding a depth of grief that no amount of professional success could fill. He was here as a deputy chief of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, a title that felt both immensely powerful and utterly hollow. A polite smattering of applause rippled through the ballroom, swelling into a respectful ovation. At the podium, Judge Patricia Whitmore beamed, accepting the Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award. At 61, she was a portrait of judicial authority, her silver hair coiled in a severe but elegant bun, her posture as unyielding as her sentencing record. She represented the old guard, a pillar of the Georgia judiciary, a woman whose name was synonymous with law and order. To Elijah, her name was synonymous with something else entirely. It was the name Marcus had whispered in his last, desperate phone call. "Thank you. Thank you," she began, her voice a smooth, cultured Southern drawl that could soothe a jury or sentence a man to death with equal grace. "It is an honor to be recognized by this esteemed foundation, among so many friends and colleagues who have dedicated their lives to the sanctity of our institutions." Elijah took a slow sip of his water, the ice clinking against the glass like a tiny, distant bell. He had studied her for 8 months, her rulings, her transcripts, her public statements. He knew the rhythm of her speech, the precise moment she would pause for effect, the way she used patriotic platitudes as a shield for her particular brand of cruelty. "Our legal system," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room, "is the bedrock of this great nation. It is a legacy handed down to us, a sacred trust, and it falls to us, to everyone in this room, to protect it from those who would seek to undermine it, to tear it down with radical theories and activist agendas." The room murmured in agreement. Elijah's grip on his glass tightened. He knew where this was going. "We see it every day, don't we?" Whitmore's tone shifted, becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial. "Lawyers, often from the most humble of origins, who come into our courtrooms not with a respect for the law, but with a grievance against society. They don't see precedent. They see oppression. They don't see justice. They see a platform for their own political crusades." Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the crowd and then, with unnerving precision, they landed directly on him. A slow, saccharine smile spread across her face. It did not reach her eyes. "And speaking of which," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth, "I see we have Dr. Elijah Washington with us tonight, from the Department of Justice. No less stand up. Elijah, let everyone see you." A spotlight. As if on cue. Found him. The low murmur of the room ceased. 200 pairs of eyes, belonging to the most powerful legal minds in the country, turned to him. He felt a wave of heat rise up his neck, the familiar sting of unwanted attention. He had no choice. He rose slowly, his face an impassive mask, and gave a slight, formal nod. "It is so admirable," Whitmore purred, her smile widening, "to see what you've managed to achieve. Elijah, truly, coming from where you did, to reach such heights, you are a credit to your people." The insult, wrapped in the silken ribbon of a compliment, landed with the force of a physical blow. A credit to your people, not a credit to his profession, his intellect, his relentless hard work. A credit to a monolithic group, defined by the color of his skin. As if his success were an anomaly, a surprising exception to an unstated rule. The room was still silent, the air thick with unspoken understanding. Some faces showed discomfort, a flicker of embarrassment. Others, too many others, held a knowing smirk. They understood the code. They spoke the same language of veiled contempt. As he stood there, frozen in the spotlight's glare, the opulent ballroom dissolved. The clinking glasses, the scent of lilies, the sea of powerful faces, it all faded away, replaced by another scene, another smell, another kind of silence. He was standing in a small, stuffy church in South Atlanta. The air smelled of wilting flowers and cheap wood polish. He was wearing his other suit, the one he kept for funerals. In the open casket lay Marcus Thompson, his best friend, his brother, his Harvard law roommate, his face a waxy, unnatural parody of the vibrant man he had been. Marcus's widow, Sarah, stood beside him, her body rigid with a grief so profound it seemed to have stolen the very air from her lungs. She wasn't crying. The silence of her sorrow was more terrifying than any scream. Judge Whitmore had not physically harmed Marcus, but she had murdered his soul. She had used the mechanisms of the law to systematically dismantle his career, his reputation, his spirit, all because he had dared to challenge her in her courtroom. Elijah remembered the quiet shame, the suffocating helplessness he felt as he looked at his friend's lifeless body. He had power. He had a position at the DOJ. But he hadn't been able to save Marcus. He had failed. The memory was a shard of ice in his gut. He blinked, and the grand ballroom swam back into focus. He was still standing. The spotlight was still on him. Judge Whitmore was still smiling that venomous, triumphant smile. And in that moment, everyone in the room misread his unnerving composure. They saw a man absorbing a public humiliation with quiet dignity. They saw restraint. They saw weakness. They were wrong. What they were seeing was the calm at the eye of a hurricane. It was the stillness of a predator that has just locked onto its prey. It was the absolute, terrifying control of a man who had channeled 3 years of unresolved grief and impotent rage into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. He met Judge Whitmore's gaze across the glittering room. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply held her stare, letting her see the promise in his eyes. It was a promise that had been forged in the sterile quiet of a morgue and tempered in the lonely darkness of countless sleepless nights. She had started this. But he, Dr. Elijah Washington, would finish it. The offices of the Civil Rights Division were the antithesis of the Fairmont's ballroom. Here, the light was functional, humming from long fluorescent tubes, reflecting off muted gray cubicle walls and government-issue linoleum floors. The air smelled of sterilized air, old paper, and the faint, ever-present aroma of burnt coffee. There was no opulent chatter, only the quiet hum of servers processing data and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. sounds that formed the solemn percussion of federal justice. The architecture was all geometric precision, a world of right angles and clean lines that left no room for ambiguity. Elijah found comfort in its sterility. It was a place where facts mattered more than feelings, where evidence was weighed on the impartial scales of the law. His own office was a corner unit, a privilege afforded by his rank. With a large window overlooking the steely geometry of downtown Washington, D.C., the view was of concrete and glass, monuments to power and bureaucracy. It suited him. His desk was a landscape of meticulous order. Memos were aligned with the edge of his blotter. Pens were arranged by color in a ceramic holder, and his computer monitor was perfectly centered. It was the desk of a man who controlled his environment because the world outside of it felt so irrevocably chaotic. On the corner of that desk, separate from the active case files, sat a single, thick manila folder. The tab was worn, the corners soft from years of handling. The label, typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, read State of Georgia v. Jennings, DJ. It was a ghost, a cold case from his and Marcus's early days as public defenders, and a case in which the prosecuting attorney had been a young, ruthlessly ambitious Patricia Whitmore. He ran his fingers over the tab, the familiar ritual a strange mix of comfort and pain. Inside that folder lay the origin of the rot. The door to his office opened, and Patricia Hayes, the director of the division, entered without knocking. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a sharp, intelligent face, framed by a no-nonsense gray bob. She carried 2 mugs of coffee and an expression of deep concern. "I saw the video," she said, placing a mug on his desk. Her voice was devoid of pity, which he appreciated. Every major network is running a clip of it. DOJ official publicly belittled at gala. They're loving it. "Good," Elijah said, not looking up from the file. "Let them. It establishes a public record of her character." Hayes sighed, sinking into the chair opposite his desk. "Elijah, I know this is personal. I know what she did to Marcus, but letting her get under your skin like that, in public—" "She isn't under my skin, Pat," he said, finally meeting her eyes. His gaze was calm, unwavering. "She's in my crosshairs. There's a difference." Hayes studied him for a long moment, taking in his unnerving stillness. She had known him for 12 years, had seen him argue before the Supreme Court, had watched him dismantle corporate polluters and corrupt police departments with the same cool, methodical precision. She had also been there when he delivered the eulogy at Marcus's funeral, the only time she had ever seen his composure crack. "The preliminary data from the Georgia probe is in," she said, changing the subject. "The algorithm flagged a statistically significant pattern of sentencing disparities in the Fulton County Superior Court. Specifically, in the courtroom of one Judge Patricia Whitmore." Elijah leaned forward, the ghost file forgotten for a moment. This was it. How significant. 43%, Hayes said, her voice grim. African-American defendants appearing before Judge Whitmore receive sentences, on average, 43% longer than white defendants for the exact same crimes, with identical criminal histories. It's the most blatant pattern of judicial bias we've seen in a decade. A cold, grim satisfaction settled in Elijah's chest. For 8 months, he had been petitioning for this investigation, building a preliminary case based on public records and anecdotal evidence. Now, he had the data. He had the weapon. "It's not just the sentencing," he said, his mind already racing ahead, connecting the dots. "It's her rulings on evidentiary motions, her bail decisions, her treatment of counsel. It's systemic. She's turned her courtroom into her own personal fiefdom, The Attorney General agrees. Hayes said, "He's authorized a full-scale covert investigation. We're sending a team in. He wants someone to lead it on the ground. Someone who can get inside. Who can operate without raising suspicion." She paused, her gaze locking with his. "He suggested you." The air in the sterile office suddenly crackled with possibility. This was more than he could have hoped for. An official assignment. The full weight of the Department of Justice behind him. It was a chance to do more than just avenge Marcus. It was a chance to dismantle the very machine that had crushed him. "A covert investigation," Elijah said. The words tasting of destiny. Posing as what? A down-on-his-luck defense attorney. Hayes replied, "We'll set you up with a new identity. A plausible backstory. Someone who wouldn't be on her radar. You'll take on cases in her court. Document everything. Find victims willing to talk. Find a clerk or a bailiff who's seen too much and is ready to flip. We need more than just statistics. Elijah. We need the human stories. We need irrefutable proof of her intent." The risk was enormous. If his cover was blown, it would be a political catastrophe for the DOJ and career suicide for him. But the thought of facing Patricia Whitmore on her own turf, of using her own prejudice and arrogance against her, was a temptation he couldn't resist. This was not just a case. It was a reckoning. "When do I start?" he asked. Hayes allowed a small, grim smile. "You already have. Last night at the gala. You established the motive. You became the victim of her public prejudice. Now, you're going to become the instrument of her downfall." She stood to leave, pausing at the door. "Just be careful. Elijah. Men like you. Driven by ghosts. You can lose yourselves in the darkness. Remember what this is about. Justice. Not just revenge." Elijah looked down at the file on his desk. State v. Jennings. He knew this was about justice. But as he remembered the hollow look in Sarah Thompson's eyes at the funeral, he also knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that justice and revenge were not mutually exclusive. For Marcus, they would be one and the same. 2 weeks later, Dr. Elijah Washington ceased to exist. In his place was Elias Cole, a man whose life story was a carefully constructed fiction of mediocrity and disappointment. Elias Cole had graduated from a Tier 3 law school, bounced between small, struggling firms in Florida, and had recently moved to Atlanta after a messy divorce to start fresh. He was the kind of lawyer Judge Whitmore would barely notice. Another overworked, underpaid public defender assigned to the endless parade of hopeless cases that clogged her docket. His expensive suits were replaced with off-the-rack jackets that never quite fit right in the shoulders. His Mercedes was traded for a 10-year-old, dented Honda Civic that smelled faintly of stale coffee. His confident posture became a weary slump. He let a shadow of a stubble grow on his face and wore glasses he didn't need. He became invisible. And, in Judge Whitmore's world, invisibility was the perfect camouflage. The Fulton County Courthouse was a monument of aging concrete and faded glory. The marble floors were scuffed and worn smooth by the ceaseless traffic of human misery. Unlike the pristine federal buildings in D.C., this place felt lived in, stained with the desperation of the people who passed through its halls. The air was a stagnant mix of anxiety and cheap disinfectant. Posing as a new contractor for the public defender's office. Elias was assigned a small, windowless office he shared with 2 other attorneys. His first week was a blur of intake interviews, boilerplate motions, and the grim reality of assembly line justice. His clients were poor, scared, and overwhelmingly black. They were the grist for Whitmore's mill. He quickly learned the unspoken rules of her courtroom. You didn't argue too forcefully. You didn't file frivolous constitutional motions. You accepted the plea deals offered by the ambitious assistant district attorney, Jennifer Clark, a sharp-eyed prosecutor in her late 20s who seemed to have Whitmore's implicit favor. To do otherwise was to invite the judge's wrath, which invariably meant a harsher sentence for your client. Elijah's first real obstacle was gaining the trust of the victims. These were people who had been chewed up and spit out by the system for so long that they viewed any lawyer, especially one working for that system, with deep suspicion. What's the point? A young man named Jamal, facing 5 years for a minor drug possession charge, asked him listlessly. She's gonna do what she's gonna do. You're just here to make it look fair. The system isn't fair, Elijah told him, his voice low and even. But that doesn't mean we don't fight. I'm going to file a motion to suppress the evidence from that traffic stop. It was an illegal search. Jamal laughed, a short, bitter sound. Yeah. Good luck with that. Last lawyer who tried that. Judge Whitmore threatened him with sanctions. My man got 10 years instead of 5. This was the culture of fear Whitmore had cultivated. She had intimidated the defense bar into submission. But Elijah wasn't just any lawyer. He began documenting everything. He used a pen with a micro-recorder to capture every interaction. He noted every instance of Whitmore cutting off a defense attorney, every racially coded remark, every ruling that defied legal precedent. His case files were no longer just about his clients. They were exhibits in his secret indictment against the judge. His close call came during his 3rd week. He was in the hallway, waiting for his case to be called, when Ada Jennifer Clark approached him. Elias Cole. Right, she said, her expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. You look familiar. Have we met? Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs, a cold spike of adrenaline piercing his carefully constructed calm. He had given a keynote at a National Black Prosecutors Association conference 2 years prior. Clark had been in the audience. Had she recognized him? He forced a weary smile. I don't think so. I've got one of those faces. I guess. Mostly, I've been practicing down in Florida. Florida, she repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. Right. Well, I just wanted to give you a heads up. Judge Whitmore isn't a fan of surprises. My offer on the Stevens kid 2 years probation is the best he's going to get. If you push that suppression motion, she'll bury him. It was a threat disguised as friendly advice. Every defendant has a right to challenge the state's evidence. Counselor, Elijah replied calmly. Clark scoffed. This isn't a law school exam. This is Fulton County. Learn the rules, or your clients will pay the price. She walked away, leaving Elijah with the chilling realization of how close he'd come to being exposed. He had to be more careful. He had to become Elias Cole completely. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a veteran court clerk named Janet Murphy, a quiet, grandmotherly woman who had worked in the courthouse for 30 years, 20 of them for Judge Whitmore. Elijah had noticed her watching him. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes whenever Whitmore would unleash a particularly cruel tirade. He approached her one afternoon as she was packing up to leave. Ms. Murphy, he said softly, I'm Elias Cole. I just wanted to say, I admire your professionalism. It must be difficult, working in that courtroom every day. She looked up at him, her eyes wary. It's a job, Mr. Cole. I know, he said, but I see the way you look when she says those things. When she calls a 19-year-old kid a thug on the record. Janet's composure wavered. She glanced around the empty hallway. You're new here. You should be careful. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Elijah said, his voice sincere. I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to help my clients. But it feels like the whole system is rigged against them. Something in his words, in his quiet intensity, seemed to reach her. She hesitated. Then her shoulders slumped in a gesture of long-held weariness. "Meet me after work," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The coffee shop on the corner. Don't let anyone see you with me." That evening, over the hiss of a cappuccino machine, Janet Murphy opened a floodgate of stories. For an hour, she spoke of the judge's casual racism behind closed chambers, the backroom deals with prosecutors, the explicit instructions to lose certain motions filed by black attorneys. "She keeps a second set of notes," Janet said, her voice trembling. "Not her official bench notes. A private log. She writes down things about the lawyers, the defendants, personal stuff. She calls it her insurance policy." This was the piece of evidence he needed, a tangible link, something that could prove intent beyond any statistical anomaly. "But the worst thing she ever did," Janet continued, her eyes filling with tears, "was what she did to that young lawyer, Marcus Thompson, a few years back. He was a good man, so bright. He just wanted to do the right thing for his client. She destroyed him, hounded him, called every judge in the state to blackball him. I overheard the calls." Elijah felt the shard of ice in his gut twist. "What happened to him?" he asked, his voice thick. "He killed himself," Janet whispered, finally breaking down into quiet sobs. "And she came into work the next day and didn't say a word. It was like he never even existed." As he listened, the pieces began to click into place. His nightmares, the fragmented memories of the Jennings case, started to sharpen. He remembered a young, aggressive prosecutor Whitmore, her condescending tone. He remembered a crucial piece of evidence that had gone missing. He remembered Marcus, passionate and righteous, arguing with her in the hallway. He went back to his bleak apartment that night and spread the contents of the State v. Jennings file across his floor. It was a complex robbery case. Their client, a young black man named David Jennings, had a solid alibi. But Whitmore, as prosecutor, had an eyewitness. The case hinged on that witness's testimony. At the last minute, Marcus had uncovered evidence that the witness had a financial motive to lie, a detail Whitmore had failed to disclose. It was a clear Brady violation. Marcus had confronted her. She had threatened him. The next day, the witness recanted, but Jennings was still convicted on a lesser charge due to a procedural error. Marcus had been devastated. Elijah stared at the old documents, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He cross-referenced the names from the Jennings file: jurors, police officers, witnesses with the list of cases he'd gathered from Whitmore's court. A horrifying pattern emerged. Defendant after defendant, lawyer after lawyer, who had appeared before Judge Whitmore over the past 3 years, had a faint, almost invisible connection to that old case. A nephew of a juror from the Jennings trial received a maximum sentence for shoplifting. A young lawyer who had interned for their defense team had 3 consecutive cases torpedoed by Whitmore on questionable grounds. Even Jamal, his current client, was the son of a woman who had been a character witness for David Jennings. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just random. Systemic racism. It was targeted. It was methodical. It was a deep, personal vendetta stretching back years. Her prejudice was real, but it was also a cover, a convenient weapon to carry out a systematic campaign of destruction against anyone and everyone who reminded her of the case that had nearly derailed her career. Marcus hadn't been just another victim of her bias. He had been the primary target. She hadn't just ruined his career. She had been hunting him. The mission was no longer just about justice for the many. It was about survival. He, Elijah Washington, was the last remaining loose end from the Jennings case. And Judge Patricia Whitmore was not a woman who left loose ends. The beast, once roused, was faster and more cunning than Elijah had anticipated. Judge Whitmore, sensing a shift in the currents of her courtroom, began to move her pieces on the board. Perhaps it was the quiet defiance of the new public defender, Elias Cole, who kept filing well-researched, inconvenient motions. Perhaps it was the nervous energy of her clerk, Janet Murphy. Whatever the cause, Whitmore's finely tuned instincts for self-preservation kicked in. She used the immense power of her office not as a gavel, but as a scalpel. She made quiet inquiries. A call to a friend at the Florida Bar Association confirmed that while Elias Cole was a real lawyer, his record was thin, almost suspiciously so. Another call to a contact in the State Marshal's Service initiated an informal background check. The first strike came not in the courtroom, but in the media. A story appeared in a local conservative blog, fed by an anonymous courthouse source, painting a picture of a radical new public defender with a checkered past and a disrespectful attitude towards the judiciary. It mentioned Elias Cole by name, accusing him of filing frivolous motions designed to clog the courts and free dangerous criminals. The smear campaign was subtle but effective. Other lawyers in the public defender's office began to eye him with suspicion. Clients grew more hesitant. The easy anonymity he had cultivated began to fray at the edges. Then came the second, more decisive blow. During a routine hearing for Jamal, Judge Whitmore stopped the proceedings. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice dangerously calm, "it has come to the court's attention that there are certain discrepancies in your bar application for the state of Georgia." Elijah's blood ran cold. He stood, his face a neutral mask. "I'm not sure I understand, Your Honor." "Oh, I think you do," Whitmore said, a triumphant gleam in her eye. She held up a thin file. "It seems you failed to disclose a prior disciplinary action from your time in Florida. A minor issue, to be sure, but a failure to disclose is a serious ethical breach." It was a complete fabrication, a lie woven from whole cloth. But it didn't matter. In her courtroom, her word was law. "I'm referring your case to the State Bar for immediate review," she announced, her voice ringing with false regret. "And, pending that review, you are suspended from practicing law in this courtroom. Effective immediately. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Cole out." Checkmate. In a single move. She had disarmed him. His cover was not just blown, it was annihilated. He was locked out, unable to gather more evidence, unable to protect his clients, unable to get near Janet Murphy or the judge's secret log. He had underestimated her ruthlessness. She wasn't just a bigot, she was a predator, and she knew how to protect her territory. As the bailiff led him from the courtroom, past the shocked faces of his colleagues and the despairing look on Jamal's face, he met Whitmore's gaze one last time. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. A clear message. "You came into my kingdom, and I cast you out. It's over." But she was wrong. It wasn't over. She hadn't just cast out a public defender. She had cornered a federal prosecutor, and by doing so, she had forced him to stop playing by her rules. The covert phase of the investigation was finished. It was time to bring the full, unyielding power of the United States government down upon her. Back in his grim apartment, Elijah shredded the Elias Cole identity. He burned the cheap suits, broke the non-prescription glasses, and shaved off the stubble. Staring at his own reflection in the mirror, he saw the face of Dr. Elijah Washington again, but harder, colder, his eyes burning with a new and dangerous resolve. He made a single phone call. "Pat, it's me," he said when Director Hayes answered. She made me. The operation is blown. Elijah. Are you safe? She asked, her voice tight with concern. I'm fine, but she started to bury the evidence. We have to move now. What have you got? I have a witness, a court clerk, Janet Murphy. She's terrified, but she's willing to talk. She knows where Whitmore keeps a private log, a record of her biases and vendettas. And I've uncovered the motive. It's not just racism. She's been systematically targeting anyone connected to an old case, State v. Jennings. It's a conspiracy to obstruct justice that goes back years. Marcus was the centerpiece of it. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. My God. Elijah. Are you sure? I'm positive. But if we don't get to Janet and that logbook now, Whitmore will destroy them both. She's accelerating her timeline, and so are we. It's time to stop investigating in the shadows. It's time to go public. He could almost hear the gears turning in Hayes's mind. A plan was forming, audacious and high risk. You're right, she said finally. But we can't just go in with a search warrant. She'll lawyer up, and the logbook will disappear forever. We need a bigger stage. We need to put her in a position where she can't hide, where she's forced to answer questions under oath in the full glare of the public spotlight. What are you thinking? Elijah asked. I'm thinking, Hayes said, a note of steel in her voice, that it's a happy coincidence that Judge Patricia Whitmore is on the president's shortlist for a nomination to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. They wouldn't just charge her with a crime. They would let her walk right into her own confirmation hearing. They would let her believe she was on the verge of her greatest triumph, only to turn it into her public execution. The Senate Judiciary Committee. Elijah breathed. Understanding dawning. She'll be under oath. On national television. Exactly. Hayes confirmed. And the AG has just agreed to appoint a special counsel to lead the DOJ's review of her nomination. Someone with an unimpeachable reputation and an intimate knowledge of the case. Elijah waited. Congratulations, Dr. Washington. Hayes said, you're about to get your day in court, and this time, you won't be the one getting escorted out. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was a theater of power. Polished mahogany, soaring ceilings, and rows of tiered seating all converged on a single point, the witness table. It was a crucible where careers were forged or shattered under the relentless glare of television lights and the pointed questions of the nation's most powerful lawmakers. Judge Patricia Whitmore sat at that table, a portrait of judicial grace and confidence. She was no longer just a state judge. She was a nominee for the U.S. Court of Appeals, on the cusp of a lifetime appointment to one of the most powerful courts in the land. She had weathered the minor storm of the Elias Cole affair, dismissing it as a disgruntled, incompetent lawyer. She believed she had won. Her smile was serene, her posture impeccable. At a separate table sat Dr. Elijah Washington, no longer in the guise of a beaten-down public defender, but in his own skin, tailored and formidable. He was addressed not as counsel, but as special counsel, appointed by the Attorney General to present the Department of Justice's findings on the nominee. The transformation was not lost on Whitmore. The look she shot him from across the room was one of pure, unadulterated hatred. The hearing, broadcast live on every major news network, began with formalities. The chairman, a venerable senator from Utah, introduced the nominee, listing her accolades. Then he turned to Elijah. Special Counsel Washington, the chairman said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. The committee understands the department has some concerns regarding Judge Whitmore's fitness for this office. You may begin. Elijah rose, his presence commanding the room's absolute attention. He did not look at Whitmore. He addressed the committee, and through them, the nation. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee," he began, his voice calm and measured. "The Department of Justice does not merely have concerns. We have evidence. Evidence of a 15-year pattern of judicial misconduct, racial bias, and a personal vendetta that has corrupted the course of justice in the state of Georgia." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Whitmore's serene smile tightened at the corners. Elijah began methodically, clinically. He presented the statistical data first, displaying charts on large screens that showed the stark, undeniable 43% sentencing disparity. He played recordings of Whitmore's own voice, captured by his micro-recorder, making racially charged statements about defendants. "This is a baseless attack," Whitmore interjected, her voice firm. "This counsel is a disgruntled employee with a political agenda. He is twisting statistics to fit a radical narrative." Elijah did not respond to her directly. He simply moved to his next piece of evidence. He called his first witness. The department calls Janet Murphy to the stand. The elderly court clerk walked tentatively to the witness table, her hands trembling. But as she sat down and was sworn in, her fear seemed to be replaced by a quiet resolve. Under Elijah's gentle but precise questioning, she recounted years of verbal abuse, of racist remarks made in chambers, of the toxic culture of fear Whitmore cultivated. And then, the bombshell. "Ms. Murphy," Elijah said, his voice soft, "can you tell the committee about the judge's private logbook?" Whitmore's face went pale. Her lawyers began whispering furiously to her. She kept a journal," Janet stammered. "In it, she wrote her real thoughts about the cases, the lawyers. She called it her insurance policy." "And do you know where she kept this logbook?" "In a locked drawer in her chambers, the one on the bottom left." Elijah turned to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, pursuant to a federal warrant executed this morning, the FBI has recovered that logbook. We would like to enter it into the record." Chaos erupted. Senators shouted questions. Whitmore's composure finally cracked. "This is an outrage. An illegal search based on the words of a lying, vindictive clerk." But the damage was done. The logbook, filled with Whitmore's own handwriting, was a confession of her prejudice, detailing her contempt for black defendants and activist lawyers. Then, Elijah moved to the heart of his case, the vendetta. "Judge Whitmore," he said, turning to her directly for the first time, "let's talk about the case of State v. Jennings." The name hit her like a physical blow. All the color drained from her face. Elijah laid out the connections, showing the committee the web she had woven over the years, targeting anyone associated with the case that had been a black mark on her record as a prosecutor. He saved Marcus for last. "And finally," he said, his voice thick with controlled emotion, "Marcus Thompson, a brilliant young lawyer who was co-counsel on the Jennings case. You didn't just disagree with him, Judge. You systematically destroyed him. You blackballed him. You drove him to take his own life, didn't you?" "That is a monstrous lie," Whitmore shot back, her voice rising. "He was an incompetent, radical lawyer who couldn't handle the pressures of the profession." It was at that moment that an aide from the DOJ hurried to Elijah's table and handed him a tablet. His eyes scanned the screen. It was a last-minute email from Janet Murphy's personal account. She had been clearing out her old computer and had found a draft email she had written years ago, during the Jennings trial, but had been too afraid to send. The room fell silent as they watched Elijah read, his expression shifting from focused intensity to something more complex, something pained. This was it. The secondary twist. The complication he hadn't seen coming. The email contained a stunning revelation. The procedural error in the Jennings case, the one that had led to the lesser conviction, had been Elijah's mistake. A minor, rookie error in filing a brief. Whitmore had discovered it and planned to use it to get both him and Marcus disbarred. To destroy them before their careers even began. The email detailed a frantic conversation Janet had overheard. Marcus had made a deal. He had deliberately taken the fall, claiming the error was his, shouldering the entire blame to protect his friend. He had sacrificed his own standing to save Elijah's future, a future he believed in more than his own. The truth slammed into Elijah, rearranging the entire history of his grief. His quest for vengeance was pure. His friend's martyrdom was not. It was a calculated, loving sacrifice. He stood at a crossroads. He could use this email. He could read it aloud and expose the entire truth, showing the depths of Whitmore's vindictive nature from the very beginning. It would be the final, devastating blow. But it would also mean revealing Marcus's secret, tarnishing the memory of his perfect, righteous friend, and admitting his own long-forgotten mistake on a national stage. He looked at Whitmore, her face a mask of defiant rage. He looked at the cameras, broadcasting his choice to millions. And he thought of Marcus. What would he have wanted? He made his choice, justice, not total annihilation. He put the tablet down. He would not use the email. He would honor his friend's sacrifice by keeping it a secret. Marcus's memory would remain pure. He would defeat Whitmore with her own crimes, not with his friend's complicated grace. Let's talk about something more recent. Judge, Elijah said, his voice regaining its steel. Let's talk about the Justice and Jurisprudence Foundation Gala. He gestured to the main screen, and there it was. The video. Crystal clear. High-definition footage from the hotel's security cameras. The whole nation watched as Judge Patricia Whitmore, nominee for the U.S. Court of Appeals, delivered her condescending, racially charged monologue. They saw her saccharine smile, heard her say, "You are a credit to your people." They saw Elijah's controlled, silent endurance. It was the final, irrefutable proof of her character, delivered in her own words, with her own smug expression. It was not a crime, but in the court of public opinion, and in the chamber of the U.S. Senate, it was a death sentence. And as the video played, Patricia Whitmore finally, irrevocably, unraveled, the mask of civility shattered into 1,000 pieces. "You!" she screamed, rising from her chair and pointing a trembling finger at Elijah, her face contorted with a rage that was shocking in its raw ugliness. "This is all you, you and your kind, always playing the victim. You come into my world, into my courtroom, with your fancy degrees, thinking you're better than us. You are nothing. You are an arrogant, ungrateful." She caught herself, but it was too late. The slur she had swallowed, the one she had been holding back her entire career, was visible in the venomous contortion of her lips. She had shown her true self to the world. The chairman's gavel cracked down, a sharp, splintering sound that seemed to fracture the very air in the room. But no one was listening. They were all staring, mesmerized and horrified, at the public self-immolation of a woman who had just sealed her own fate. Elijah Washington stood perfectly still. He had not raised his voice. He had not revealed his deepest secret. He had simply held up a mirror, and the monster had destroyed itself. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within the hour, the White House had officially withdrawn Patricia Whitmore's nomination. By nightfall, The Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission had suspended her from the bench. The media erupted in a firestorm of analysis and condemnation. The video of her tirade played on a continuous loop, a digital monument to her spectacular downfall. The following morning, federal marshals arrived at her stately home in the Atlanta suburbs and arrested her. The charges included conspiracy to obstruct justice, perjury, and multiple civil rights violations. The woman who had once wielded the power of the state was now a defendant in its custody. Elijah watched the news from Director Hayes's office back in Washington. The city's monuments stood stark against a gray, overcast sky. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion, the adrenaline of the past few months finally draining away, leaving a hollow space behind. "You made the right choice, you know," Hayes said, handing him a mug of coffee. She had read Janet's email. At the hearing, not using the information about Marcus. Elijah stared into his mug. It was his story to tell, not mine. My job was to bring her to justice for her crimes, not to win at any cost. "There's a difference between vengeance and justice," Hayes said quietly. "Vengeance is about tearing things down. Justice is about building them back up. You chose to build, to protect your friend's memory." He knew she was right. But the victory felt complex, tinged with the lingering sorrow of what had been lost. He had exposed the rot, but it couldn't bring Marcus back. It couldn't erase the years of pain inflicted on hundreds of families. His work, however, had just begun. The Whitmore case became a catalyst. The Department of Justice launched a full-scale pattern or practice investigation into the Georgia state court system, uncovering networks of corruption and bias that had festered for decades. Other judges were investigated, prosecutors were sanctioned, and the entire system was forced into a painful but necessary process of reform. The falling action was not a single event, but a series of ripples spreading outward, slowly, inexorably, changing the landscape of justice in a place that had long resisted change. 16 months later, the Georgia sun, once a hostile observer, felt warm and benevolent on Elijah's face. He stood on the steps of a newly dedicated building on the campus of Emory Law School, a sleek, modern structure of glass and steel that seemed to lean into the future. A banner unfurled above the entrance read, "The Marcus Thompson Memorial Foundation for Constitutional Rights." Patricia Whitmore had been convicted on all counts and was currently serving a 12-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. Her name had become a byword for judicial corruption, a cautionary tale taught in law schools across the country. But today was not about her. It was about Marcus. Elijah, standing at a podium before a crowd of students, faculty, and supporters, had established the foundation using his own resources, along with a substantial settlement from a civil suit against the state. Its mission was simple: to fund scholarships for underprivileged law students and to provide legal aid to victims of judicial misconduct. It would create an army of lawyers, just like Marcus. Marcus Thompson believed that the law was a shield to protect the vulnerable, Elijah said, his voice steady and clear, carrying over the hushed crowd. He believed that justice was not a privilege for the few, but a right for all. He lost his life because he held fast to those beliefs in the face of a corrupt system. This foundation will ensure that his fight continues, that his belief in the promise of American justice was not in vain. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled, a familiar figure approached him. It was Sarah Thompson, Marcus's widow. The profound, silent grief he remembered from the funeral had been replaced by a quiet strength, a resilience in her eyes that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "He would have loved this, Elijah," she said softly. "He would have been so proud of you." "I just wish he were here to see it," Elijah replied, the old ache returning. He is, Sarah said with a small smile. She handed him a small, worn cardboard box. I was clearing out his old desk from the office. I thought you should have this. Later that evening, in the quiet of his hotel room, Elijah opened the box. It contained old photos from their law school days, a dog-eared copy of a constitutional law textbook they had both studied, and a single, sealed envelope. On the front, in Marcus's familiar, slightly messy script, was his name, Elijah. His hands trembled as he opened it. It was a letter, written shortly after the Jennings trial had ended, a letter Marcus had never sent. I know you're beating yourself up about that filing error. Stop. You're going to be one of the great ones. I see it. Everyone sees it. That woman, Whitmore, she saw it too. That's why she was so afraid of you. She wanted to cut you down before you even had a chance to grow. I couldn't let that happen. My career. Your career. It wasn't even a choice. Your voice is going to be too important someday. You're going to change things. I made a bet. My friend, I bet on you. Don't ever let them silence you. Don't ever let them make you feel small. Your fight is the one that matters. Your brother, Marcus. Tears streamed down Elijah's face, hot and cleansing. It was not the closure he had expected, but the closure he had needed. It was absolution. It was peace. The weight of his own perceived failure, a guilt he had carried silently for years, finally lifted. He looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, the city lights twinkling like a promise. The next morning, he would present the foundation's very first scholarship to a brilliant, fiery young woman from the inner city who reminded him so much of a young Marcus Thompson. His quest for revenge was over, but the work of justice, the work of honoring his friend's sacrifice by building something new, something hopeful, something that would last, that work was just beginning.